Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into poverty in America. And, when you think about it, we tend to think of the U.S. as, the land of opportunity, the wealthiest nation in the world,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But when you start looking at the reality, it's a lot more complex than that. For example, did you know that the U.S. actually has a higher poverty rate than many other developed countries?
It's a pretty shocking statistic when you think about it.
It really is, and it kind of makes you question, the whole idea of the American dream.
It does. It raises some serious questions about, the promises of our society.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to be unpacking some really insightful arguments from an NPR Throughline episode. It featured a sociologist and Pulitzer Prize winner, Matthew Desmond.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, his work is really fascinating, and it sheds light on the systemic and historical roots of poverty in America.
You know what I find so compelling about Desmond's work is that he doesn't just focus on the numbers. He really paints a vivid picture of what poverty actually looked like in people's lives.
Yeah, he brings those realities to life.
He talks about, the constant fear of eviction, the struggle to put food on the table, the lack of access to quality health care, and the immense mental and emotional toll it takes on individuals and families.
He doesn't just say, people experience substandard housing. He describes the leaky roofs, the mold creeping up the walls, the lack of heat in the winter.
Yeah, you can really feel the weight of those experiences when you read his work.
Absolutely. It makes you stop and think.
And, he also challenges that common misconception that poverty is simply a result of personal failings. He argues that it's deeply intertwined with, our history, our policies, and even our own everyday choices.
That's a really crucial point, and it brings us to the historical context that he lays out. He takes us back to post-World War II America, a time when the country, was experiencing this surge in economic growth, and there was this sense of shared prosperity. But he points out that affluence often masked the reality of poverty that persisted, particularly for marginalized communities.
Right, that prosperity wasn't evenly distributed, and for many, the American dream remained out of reach.
Exactly. And it wasn't until the 1960s that this hidden poverty was truly brought into the national spotlight. And that was thanks in part to the publication of Michael Harrington's influential book, The Other America.
Oh, yeah, that was a landmark book, wasn't it?
It was a real wake-up call for many Americans. It exposed the harsh realities of poverty in America, and it sparked a national conversation that ultimately led to President Lyndon B. Johnson's declaration of a war on poverty.
Do you remember learning about that in school?
Vaguely.
It was a pretty ambitious undertaking, aiming to eliminate poverty through a combination of social programs and economic reforms.
It was. And while the war on poverty did lead to some initial successes, particularly in the early years, with the introduction of programs like food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Desmond argues that over time these programs shifted from providing cures to offering what he calls dialysis.
Dialysis. That's an interesting analogy.
What do you think he means by that?
Well, I guess he's suggesting that while these programs provide essential support and act as a safety net, they haven't really addressed the root causes of poverty.
So they help people survive, but they don't necessarily equip them to thrive and escape poverty permanently.
Exactly. It's like treating the symptoms without curing the disease.
That makes a lot of sense, and it raises the question of how we even measure poverty in the first place. You can't really address a problem if you don't have a clear understanding of its scope, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the poverty line comes in.
Right, poverty line.
It was developed back in the 1960s by an economist named Molly Orshansky, and it was based on a very basic calculation, the cost of a minimal food budget multiplied by 3.
It sounds pretty straightforward on the surface, but is that really an accurate reflection of poverty today?
That's the problem. It's incredibly outdated. The poverty line doesn't take into account the skyrocketing costs of housing, healthcare, childcare, or regional differences in the cost of living.
It's like trying to navigate modern life with a map from the 1960s.
Exactly.
So we're essentially relying on a flawed measure that doesn't capture the true extent of poverty in America.
Precisely, and that's why in 2011, the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM, was adopted. It provides a much more accurate picture of poverty by taking into account a wider range of expenses and adjusting for geographical differences.
So if we were to use the SPM instead of the official poverty line, would we see a significant difference in the numbers?
Absolutely. The SPM paints a much bleaker picture, revealing that poverty is more widespread and deeper than the official poverty line suggests.
Wow.
It also highlights how many of our current anti-poverty programs are inadequate. because they're based on outdated assumptions about the cost of living.
That's a really crucial point, and it ties into Desmond's argument about the decline of worker power as a key driver of persistent poverty. He emphasizes the link between declining union membership, stagnant wages, and the effectiveness of those anti-poverty programs.
Right, think back to the early years of the war on poverty. Those programs were more effective in part because the labor market was strong. Unions had more bargaining power, wages were higher, and there were more opportunities for people to climb out of poverty.
But that's not the case anymore.
No, wages have stagnated for many workers, union membership has declined, and the cost of living has continued to rise.
Exactly, and this means that even robust social safety nets can't fully compensate for that lack of economic opportunity. People may have access to food stamps or Medicaid, but if their wages are too low to cover basic expenses like housing and childcare, they remain trapped in a cycle of poverty.
That's the heartbreaking reality for so many Americans. And, it's not just about blaming, there's neoliberal policies for this shift. While they certainly played a role, Desmond argues that the decline of worker power, it began even earlier. It's a complex issue with deep historical roots that, it really challenges those typical left-right narratives
Yeah.
that we often hear about poverty.
Right, like it's not as simple as just saying, it's all the fault of this political party or this economic system.
Exactly. He wants us to understand the systemic forces at play and how they contribute to this persistent problem.
Okay, so then if we're spending trillions of dollars on these anti-poverty programs, where is all that money actually going? Why is poverty still such a pervasive issue?
Well, that's a great question, and Desmond points to a few disturbing trends. One of them is that a significant portion of this aid simply doesn't reach the people who need it most. He highlights the TINF scandal, for example, where states were found to be misusing funds that were intended for struggling families.
The TNF scandal. For those who might not be familiar, can you remind us what TNF stands for?
Sure, TNF stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It's a federal program that provides cash assistance to low-income families with children.
So states were essentially diverting money away from those families.
Yeah, essentially.
That's awful.
It's a stark reminder that even when resources are allocated, they don't always reach their intended recipients.
It raises some serious questions about accountability and oversight within these systems.
It does.
It's just disheartening to think that those funds could have made a real difference in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's the issue of welfare avoidance, where people who are eligible for assistance don't even apply for it.
I've heard that attributed to, stigma, like people are too proud or ashamed to ask for help. But Desmond suggests it's often something else, right?
Right. He argues that it's not always about shame or pride, but often the result of, bureaucratic red tape and a system that's incredibly difficult to navigate.
Oh, so it's less about like personal feelings and more about these systemic barriers.
Exactly. Imagine having to jump through countless hoops and fill out endless paperwork. When you're already struggling to keep your head above water, it can be incredibly daunting and discouraging.
It's almost as if the system is designed to make it difficult for people to access the help they need.
That's a valid point, and Desmond takes it even further with a rather provocative argument. He suggests that poverty actually benefits a lot of Americans, not just the wealthy.
That's a bold statement. What does he mean by that?
He argues that many of us benefit often unknowingly from the existence of poverty. We enjoy low-wage labor, cheap goods and services, and even things like inflated property values that are driven by housing scarcity.
So you're saying our comfortable lifestyles are, in a way, built on a system that keeps others struggling.
That's the uncomfortable truth that Desmond wants us to confront. It's not about guilt-tripping anyone. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of our economic system. Our individual choices have ripple effects, and understanding that is crucial if we want to create a more just and equitable society.
That brings us to another pressing issue that's been in the news a lot lately, the housing crisis. It's not just impacting low-income families anymore, it's affecting people across all income levels. Soaring rents and home prices are making it incredibly difficult to find, decent, affordable housing.
Yeah, the housing crisis is a perfect example of how the consequences of poverty extend far beyond, those officially living below the poverty line. It's like a rising tide that lifts the yachts but swamps the rowboats. When housing is scarce and expensive, everyone feels the squeeze, but those at the bottom are hit the hardest.
And it's not just, market forces driving this crisis, is it? Desmond points to other factors, like segregation and exclusionary zoning laws, as significant contributors to the problem.
Exactly. Those policies intentionally concentrate poverty in certain areas, while making it nearly impossible to build affordable housing in more affluent communities.
So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly. And for example, if zoning regulations only allow for single-family homes on large lots, it automatically excludes lower-income families,
Huh?
who often rely on multifamily housing options like apartments.
Right, because those types of housing are usually more affordable.
Exactly. It's a form of economic segregation that's baked into the very structure of our cities and towns.
Desmond highlights a fascinating case study that offers a potential solution to this problem. The Mount Laurel Doctrine in New Jersey. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, the Mount Laurel Doctrine is a legal precedent. That requires communities to provide their fair share of affordable housing.
Interesting.
It directly challenges that not in my backyard mentality that often prevents the construction of affordable housing in more affluent areas.
It forces communities to acknowledge their responsibility to provide housing options for people of all income levels. But there's a lot of resistance to affordable housing projects. People worry about property values declining, about increased crime rates, about their neighborhoods changing. How does the Mount Laurel Doctrine address those concerns?
Well, one of the key points Desmond makes is that these fears are often unfounded. Studies have shown that building affordable housing in more affluent communities doesn't actually lower property values.
So that's a myth.
Yeah, it's a myth that's often used to justify exclusionary zoning practices. The Mount Laurel Doctrine demonstrates that creating mixed income communities can be done, and it can be done without negatively impacting property values.
So it's possible to create more inclusive communities without sacrificing those economic interests.
Exactly. It requires a shift in mindset, a willingness to embrace diversity and challenge the ingrained patterns of segregation that have shaped our communities for far too long.
So what can we as individuals do to address this complex issue of poverty in America? Desmond doesn't just leave us with a bleak diagnosis, right? He offers a call to action.
He calls on all of us to become poverty abolitionists. He acknowledges the scale and complexity of the problem, but he also insists that change is possible. It's not about just throwing money at the problem or relying solely on government programs.
Now, it's about more than just, writing a check to a charity or
Yeah.
voting for a particular candidate.
Right. It's about a fundamental shift in how we think about poverty, its root causes, and our own roles in perpetuating or dismantling the system.
So it's not just about systemic change, but also about individual responsibility.
Exactly. He argues that we can all make a difference in our everyday lives. It might be through supporting worker rights, advocating for affordable housing in our communities, or even reconsidering things like our personal tax deductions and how we invest our money.
So it's about being more mindful of the choices we make and how they impact others.
Precisely, he uses the example of the mortgage interest deduction, a massive tax break that disproportionately benefits wealthy homeowners and costs the government billions each year. He argues that we could be using that money to fund programs that directly help lift people out of poverty.
That's a powerful example of how our current system often prioritizes subsidizing affluence over alleviating poverty. It really makes you think about where our priorities lie as a society.
It does, and it challenges us to ask ourselves what sacrifices we're willing to make, both individually and collectively, to create a more just and equitable society.
It can feel overwhelming to think about tackling such a deeply rooted problem.
Oh.
But Desmond seems to offer a message of hope, doesn't he?
He does. One of the encouraging points he makes is that there's actually a lot of bipartisan support for addressing poverty. People across the political spectrum are tired of seeing their neighbors struggle, and they want solutions.
So despite the polarization and division in our current political climate, there's still common ground to be found on this issue.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that poverty is not a partisan issue. It's a human issue. It's about recognizing the shared values that unite us. The desire for a strong economy, safe communities, and a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear that there's some potential for common ground on this issue. It can be easy to, get caught up in all the political rhetoric and lose sight of our shared humanity.
I agree. And Desmond, he doesn't just talk about systemic change. He also emphasizes the importance of individual action. He encourages us to get involved in our own communities, to show up at those zoning board meetings, to advocate for more inclusive housing policies.
She's saying, don't just sit back and complain about the problem, actually go out there and do something about it.
Exactly. He acknowledges that it might be uncomfortable, it might even cause some friction, but he sees it as a crucial part of being a poverty abolitionist.
It's a reminder that change doesn't just happen at the national level. It starts in our own backyards. the choices we make each day, and in the ways we engage with our local communities.
Right. And what's particularly striking about Desmond's approach is that he doesn't shy away from examining his own role in the system. He talks about how he grapples with his own privilege as a Pulitzer Prize winner. As a professor at Princeton, an institution with a multi-billion-dollar endowment.
It's refreshing to hear someone in his position acknowledge their own complicity. It makes his message even more powerful, don't you think?
I agree. It demonstrates a level of self-awareness and humility that is often lacking in these discussions. He's not pointing fingers. He's inviting us all, regardless of our income or background, to examine our own choices and actions and to ask ourselves, what can I do to create a more just and equitable world?
Wow, that's a powerful question that we should all be asking ourselves. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to reflect on?
Well, I think first and foremost, poverty in America is a complex issue with, deep historical roots, but it's not inevitable, as Desmond argues. It's a policy choice, and therefore something we have the power to change.
So we're not just stuck with this problem, we can actually do something about it.
Exactly. And secondly, true progress requires both systemic change and individual action. We need to address the systemic issues that perpetuate poverty. But we also need to examine our own choices and behaviors and ask ourselves how we can contribute to a more just and equitable society.
It's not an either proposition, it's a both and.
Right. We need to work together to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to ponder. What role will you play in creating a more just and equitable society? It's a question worth asking ourselves, and it's a journey worth embarking on. If this deep dive has sparked your interest in learning more about this crucial issue, we highly recommend listening to the full Throughline episode titled Poverty by America. You can find it on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to subscribe to the deep dive for more thought-provoking explorations of the issues that matter most. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.